Richard Hale had everything people dreamed of: wealth, power, respect, and a name that filled magazines and business headlines. But none of that mattered on the night everything changed. It started with something small, something most billionaires would never even notice. The quiet, shaky way his longtime maid, Miss Marlene, walked out of the mansion after finishing her shift. She had worked for him for nearly 20 years, always steady, always smiling, always the kind of gentle soul who made the house feel warm. Yet that evening, her shoulders were lowered, her steps slow, and there was a strange heaviness in her eyes he had never seen before. Richard couldn't ignore it. Not this time. He had been buried in paperwork when he first noticed her leave, clutching her worn black purse against her side like she was holding on to something precious. Normally, she took the staff shuttle home, laughing with the younger maids and wishing the security guards good night. But today, she slipped through the side gate alone, avoiding everyone. Something wasn't right. Something deep inside Richard told him that Miss Marlene was carrying a burden far heavier than she let on, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain. The thought unsettled him. Marlene had always been more than just an employee. She had been there since the early days, since before Richard became a billionaire, back when the mansion was smaller, the walls were less polished, and his heart was less complicated. She had watched him grow from a young, grieving widower into the powerful man the world now recognized. She had been a quiet presence in the background of his life, offering warm tea on cold nights, reminding him to eat when he forgot, checking on him the way a mother checks on a child who refuses to admit he's hurting. And now, seeing her move like a shadow try and disappear, something inside Richard stirred with worry. Without thinking too much, he grabbed his coat, turned off the lights, and slipped out after her. The night air was cool, the kind that carried both comfort and mystery. Marlene walked with a slight limp he had never noticed before. She kept checking over her shoulder, as though afraid someone might be following her. Richard stayed far behind, not wanting her to feel watched, but needing to know the truth. He wasn't sure why he felt so protective, only that something deep in his gut urged him forward. For the first time in his life, the billionaire found himself walking down streets he had only driven past in his luxury car. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks. The hum of distant traffic mixed with the occasional bark of a stray dog. Slowly, the scenery around him changed. Quiet neighborhoods replaced the polished safety of his wealthy district, and small houses with peeling paint began to fill the streets. Richard's pace slowed as he realized just how far Marlene traveled every night. He had always assumed she lived comfortably. Her job paid well. She never complained. And she always came in looking neat and put together. But now, watching her disappear deeper into the rundown part of town, Richard felt something heavy settle in his chest. Had he been blind all these years? Had he missed signs? Had he failed someone who had been loyal to him longer than anyone else? Marlene finally turned down a narrow alleyway lit by a single flickering lamp. Richard hesitated at the corner, unsure whether to keep going. But then he heard her cough, a deep, tired cough that didn't sound like a simple cold. His heart tightened. He stepped forward, carefully keeping his distance. The alley led to a small, aging building with cracked steps and a faded number above the door. Marlene pushed the door open slowly, her hand shaking slightly, and slipped inside without turning on a light. Richard stood across the street, staring at the dark entrance, feeling an uneasiness he couldn't shake. What was she hiding? What had she been carrying all this time? He moved closer, making sure to stay quiet. When he reached the door, he heard faint sounds from inside, soft footsteps, the creak of old floorboards, and something else. Something emotional, a quiet voice, a sniffle, a whisper. Richard froze. It didn't sound like Marlene was alone. The billionaire leaned gently toward the cracked window near the side of the building, but the inside was too dim to see anything clearly. Instead, he listened. He heard Marlene speaking softly, her voice filled with a tenderness that sounded almost like fear. There was another voice, too, weak, trembling, barely audible. Richard felt his heart pound. Was she caring for someone? Was someone hurt? Why didn't she ask for help? A wave of guilt washed over him. He had always prided himself on being a good employer, on treating his staff fairly. But maybe fairness wasn't the same as truly knowing someone. Maybe fairness wasn't enough. Here he was, a billionaire with every resource in the world, and yet his oldest employee was hiding something so painful she couldn't even bring herself to speak about it. He took a slow step back, unsure whether to knock on the door or walk away. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Should he reveal he had followed her? Would she be ashamed, angry, or would she finally let someone in? Before he could decide, he saw the silhouette of Marlene through the slightly parted curtains. She was kneeling beside someone, a figure lying on a small bed, frail and barely moving. Even from the distance, Richard could see the sadness in her posture. She touched the person's forehead gently, like someone who had been doing it for years. Richard felt a sting behind his eyes. His breath caught. He had never seen Marlene look so fragile, so torn apart. And then, just as he gathered the courage to step closer, something unexpected happened. The person on the bed lifted a hand, and Marlene held it tightly, whispering words Richard couldn't hear. But one word did reach him, a single, broken word that drifted to the quiet night air, stopping him in his tracks. "Mama?" Richard's entire world shifted. His throat tightened, his eyes burned, and suddenly everything he thought he knew about the woman who worked faithfully in his home for 2 decades dissolved in front of him. Nothing made sense anymore, not her long hours, her tired smile, her silent sacrifices. He took a breath, trying to steady himself, because now, more than ever, he needed to know the truth, and what he was about to learn would leave him in tears. Richard stood frozen in the cold night air, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. The fragile voice calling Marlene Mama kept echoing inside him, repeating over and over like a question he couldn't answer. He had known this woman for 2 decades, trusted her, depended on her, even confided in her during the darkest times of his life. Yet here was an entire world she had hidden behind tired eyes and polite smiles. A world he never even tried to look into. He backed away from the window slowly, afraid the floor might creak and alert her. The last thing he wanted was for Marlene to know he was spying on her. She was private, proud, and deeply dignified. If she found out he followed her, she wouldn't forgive it. And Richard wasn't sure he could forgive himself either. But the image of her kneeling beside that frail figure tugged at him in a way he couldn't shake. He walked to the end of the block and stood under a dim streetlight, trying to gather his thoughts. A part of him wanted to storm inside, ask her why she never told him she needed help. Another part insisted he had no right. No right to question her, no right to intrude, no right to demand answers. But the worry ate at him, stronger with every passing second. Who was that person? Why were they so sick? Why was Marlene living in this crumbling building? In conditions no one should have to endure, especially not someone who spent her days serving a billionaire. The more he thought about it, the heavier his chest felt. He remembered moments from years ago, moments he never gave much importance to at the time. Times when Marlene arrived at work with tired eyes but insisted she was fine. Times she left early because of personal matters. Times he asked if she needed anything, and she always smiled and said, "No, sir. God's taking care of me." He used to take those words as humility. Now, he wondered if they were a quiet cry she hoped no one would notice. Richard ran a hand through his hair, feeling something unfamiliar, guilt, maybe even shame. How many times had he walked past her without noticing the weight she carried? How many times had she given him kindness without asking for anything in return? He turned back toward the building, unable to tear himself away. He didn't want to disturb her, but he also couldn't walk away from her. He needed to understand. He needed to know the truth before it crushed him completely. Inside, Marlene's silhouette moved, her shoulders shaking slightly as she wiped her eyes. Richard felt a painful twist in his chest. Seeing her cry, even from a distance, felt wrong. Marlene wasn't the crying type. She was steady, strong, the kind of woman who held others together even when she was falling apart. To see her break, even quietly, it shook him in ways he wasn't prepared for. He paced slowly across the sidewalk, thinking back to the first time they met. He had just lost his wife, and the house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories he wasn't ready to face. Marlene had been hired on a trial basis, but from the first week, she became more than an employee. She filled the silence with gentle humming, kept the house warm, cooked meals he barely ate but needed. He never asked where she came from, never asked about her past, only knew she was good at her job and even better at reading people's hearts. Somehow she always sensed when he was struggling, yet he never once asked if she was struggling too. The realization sank in deep, heavier than he expected. He waited for nearly an hour, watching through the thin curtains as Marlene cared for the person inside. She adjusted pillows, wiped their face gently with a warm cloth, stirred a small pot on a portable stove, and whispered soft words that carried comfort. Her tenderness made Richard's throat tighten. She moved like someone who had done this countless times, someone familiar with suffering and patience. The frail voice spoke occasionally, but Richard couldn't make out the words. Each one made Marlene pause, nod, or wipe her eyes again. Eventually, Richard saw her shoulders drop, exhausted. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the person's hand like it was keeping her grounded. He stepped back from the window, guilt swirling inside him. He shouldn't be watching her like this. It felt wrong. It felt invasive. But the fear of walking away felt worse. He made one final decision. He wouldn't leave until she was safe for the night. So he crossed the street, sat on a worn-out concrete step near the building's entrance, and waited quietly. He kept his head down, pretending to look at his phone. Whenever someone passed by, the night grew colder, but he didn't move. When the door finally creaked open, he lifted his gaze. Marlene stepped outside, pulling her thin sweater tighter around her shoulders. For the first time in his life, she looked truly old, older than he ever noticed. The dim light above the entrance exposed the deep lines etched into her face, the tiredness in her eyes, and the weight she carried like a silent shadow. She didn't see him at first. She stood by the railing, breathing slowly, staring at the ground as though trying to gather enough strength to start walking again. Richard's heart clenched. He wanted to call her name, but the words stuck in his throat. So many questions tangled inside him that he didn't know which one to ask first. He took a small step forward. And that's when she looked up. Her eyes widened, not with warmth or recognition, but with shock and something close to fear. Fear he didn't expect. "Mr. Hale," she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard froze, his breath catching. Marlene blinked fast, as if hoping she was imagining him. "What are you doing here, sir?" There was no easy answer, no simple explanation that wouldn't hurt her or expose the truth. He opened his mouth, trying to find words that wouldn't break the fragile moment between them. But before he could speak, a weak cough echoed from inside the apartment. Marlene flinched. Her eyes darted toward the door, then back at him. "Sir, please, you shouldn't be here." Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't sharp. It was scared. A kind of scared that made Richard's heart sink. He stepped closer, gently. "Marlene, who is that inside?" She stiffened instantly. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes glistened in the dim light. For a moment, she looked like she might run back inside and lock the door. Richard lowered his voice. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ask for help?" Marlene swallowed hard, tears pooling but refusing to fall. She shook her head slowly, her chin trembling. "You don't understand, sir," she whispered. "There are things I never want to bring into your world." Richard's breath hitched. "But why? You've taken care of my home, of me, for years. Why would you hide something like this?" She closed her eyes as if the truth weighed too much. A long, painful silence stretched between them. Then she whispered, barely audible, "Because some secrets, sir, are not just heavy. They are dangerous." Richard felt a chill run through him. Dangerous? Before he could ask what she meant, a shadow moved inside the dim apartment. A figure stepped closer to the doorway, unsteady, weak, but unmistakably watching them. Marlene quickly reached for the doorknob, panic rising in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, "go home, sir, before this gets worse." But Richard didn't move, because the person inside had just spoken again, this time louder, clearer, and with a tone that made Richard's blood run cold. "Don't let him leave, Mama." The door creaked. Marlene's breath caught, and Richard realized He was already in the middle of something far bigger, far darker, and far more personal than he ever imagined. For a moment, Richard thought he had misheard the voice from inside the dim apartment. But the words were clear, too clear to ignore. The trembling figure who had called Marlene Mama was now asking her not to let him leave. The fear in Marlene's eyes grew sharper, deeper, almost pleading. She stood half blocking the doorway, as if she could shield both of them from whatever truth waited inside. Richard took a slow breath, trying to steady the uneasy thumping in his chest. "Marlene," he whispered, "talk to me, please." She clutched the doorknob tighter. The weight she carried across her shoulders felt heavy enough to break her in half. For the first time since he'd known her, she wouldn't look directly at him. "Sir, not here. Not now," she murmured. "You don't know the whole story." "And I want to," Richard said, trying to keep his voice soft, calm. "I need to understand." Before she could answer, the figure inside took another step forward. In the faint light spilling from the hallway, Richard could finally make out a young man, thin, pale, barely standing. His cheeks were hollow, his skin sickly, and his eyes held a strange mix of fear and recognition. Not recognition of Richard personally, but recognition of his presence, like he had expected someone with his kind of power to eventually show up. The young man let out a shaky breath. "You said he'd never find out," he whispered to Marlene. Richard's stomach twisted. "Find out what?" Marlene turned sharply, her voice gentle but firm. "Please sit down. I'll handle this." Her worry, her exhaustion, all of it told Richard this wasn't just about illness or money or hardship. This was something deeper, something she had tried to keep buried. The young man didn't sit. He stared at Richard like someone evaluating a threat. "Why did you follow her?" he asked quietly. Richard didn't know how to answer. He had no excuse that wouldn't sound wrong. He had followed her out of concern, yes, but also curiosity, guilt, and something else he couldn't fully name. "I was worried," he said honestly. "I noticed she wasn't herself." The young man let out a weak, humorless laugh. "Of course you notice now." Marlene's breath hitched. "Please," she whispered to him, "don't do this." But the damage was already done. The tension in the small hallway grew so thick that Richard felt it pressing against his ribs. He looked at Marlene again. "Just tell me who he is." She hesitated, her throat working as if the truth itself hurt to swallow. "He's my son," she said finally, her voice cracking on the last word. Richard felt something inside him drop. All this time, all these years, she had a son who needed her, a son who was sick, a son she hid, even from him. "I never knew," he whispered. "You weren't supposed to," she said, brushing away tears with the back of her hand. "I didn't want you mixed in with this." "With what?" he asked softly. She closed her eyes. "With the danger, the trouble, the people who started all this." Richard blinked in confusion. "What danger? What people?" The young man stepped forward again, gripping the doorframe for balance. He looked like he might collapse any second, but his eyes held a sharpness that contradicted his weak body. "Mama thinks she's protecting you," he said, "but it's already too late." Marlene shot him a warning look, but he ignored it. "She works in your house," he continued, his voice trembling. "You think the things happening there, the strange calls, the late-night visitors, the shipments, you think all that hasn't put her at risk?" Richard's mind raced. Strange calls? Late-night visitors? Shipments? He had brushed off many incidents in the past months. Odd security alerts, unannounced deliveries that staff returned, unusual inquiries about his schedule. He chalked it all up to business. But now it sounded like something else entirely. "What are you talking about?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. The young man tried to speak again, but a coughing spell shook his entire body. Marlene rushed to him instantly, placing a steadying hand on his back and whispering soothing words. Richard watched helpless as she held him close, her worry spilling out with every breath. She guided him back toward the chair near the bed and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. Her movements were gentle, practiced, full of a mother's instinct. Richard had never seen her like this, so raw, so exposed, so human in her struggle. When she returned to the doorway, Her expression had shifted. There was pain, yes, but also a strange calm, as if she had made peace with the fact that the truth was no longer hers to hide. She faced Richard with tired eyes. "His name is Samuel," she said quietly. "He's my only child." Richard nodded slowly, trying to process the weight of everything unraveling around him. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to fire me," she whispered. "Or worse, take an interest in something that could hurt you." Richard felt a twist of confusion. Why would having a son get you fired? "It's not just that he's sick," she said, "or broke, or jobless. It's what he got mixed up in." Samuel lifted his head. "Mama?" "No," she said, raising a hand gently. "I need him to know." She looked at Richard again, her eyes heavy with memories she never spoke of. "Samuel used to work security for a shipping company," she began. "They told him they were transporting electronics and parts for medical equipment. But it was a lie. He found out something he wasn't supposed to. Something dangerous." Richard swallowed hard, feeling the tension thicken. What did he find out? Marlene lowered her voice. That the company was moving illegal materials under the cover of legitimate shipments. And when Samuel tried to report it, they threatened him. The young man nodded weakly. "They ruined my name, put me on blacklists, made it impossible to work. And then they came after Mama." Richard's chest tightened. "After her? Why?" "Because she works for you," Samuel whispered, his voice cracking. "And you're the only person powerful enough to expose them. They thought she'd convince you to ignore certain things, or that she could be used to get close to information." Marlene wiped a tear, her voice shaking. "I never told them anything. I never let anything near your home. But they didn't care. They said if Samuel didn't keep quiet, they'd come for me." Richard felt a cold wave move through him. This wasn't just hardship or poverty or illness. This was danger, real danger. And Marlene had been walking into his home every day, carrying this fear alone. He took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "Why didn't you ask me for help?" Her eyes filled again. "Because good people who get close to this disappear." The apartment went silent. Even the air felt still. And then Samuel said something that sent a chill down Richard's spine. "They're watching you, too," he murmured. "You just don't know it yet." Richard's breath caught. Marlene flinched. The tension in the tiny room snapped tighter, pulling all three of them into its grip. Richard looked at them, realizing something unsettling. He had stepped into a situation far more dangerous than he ever imagined, and there was no turning back now. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in with every word spoken. Richard stood near the doorway, his palms damp, his heart thudding with a slow, heavy beat. Samuel's warning echoed in his mind. "They're watching you, too." Something about the way he had said it, the tremble in his voice mixed with certainty, made it impossible to dismiss. Marlene moved quietly around the apartment, closing the curtains and double-checking the locks. The movements were familiar to her, practiced, like someone who lived every day expecting danger. Richard had never seen her this way, alert, cautious, almost afraid of her own shadow. It struck him harder than he expected. This was the same woman who cheerfully dusted picture frames, who hummed while folding laundry, who always said she was doing just fine. Now he realized she had been hiding a storm beneath that smile. He stepped farther into the apartment without thinking, compelled by something he couldn't quite name. Concern, maybe fear, maybe guilt, maybe all of it. "Marlene," he whispered, "just tell me, what exactly are they after?" She paused, her hand gripping the edge of the table for balance. Her eyes shimmered with hesitation. "Everything," she said softly. "Information, silence, control. They don't care what they have to do to get it." Samuel nodded weakly from his chair. "It started with me. But once I lost my job, once I was blacklisted, they used Mama as leverage. Then they started watching her workplace. And your house, became part of the map." Richard's brow tightened. "Why my house? I've never had anything to do with whatever this is." "That's exactly why," Samuel said. "You're clean, powerful. You have connections. If someone like you discovered what they were moving through the city, It would put everything at risk for them. Richard tried to steady his breath, but unease crawled under his skin. He thought about the strange deliveries his staff had rejected, the unknown numbers calling the landline, the security system glitching without explanation. He had brushed all of it off as technical issues or simple mistakes. Now, he wondered how much of it had been deliberate. Marlene stepped next to her son, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "I never wanted you dragged into this, sir," she said. Her voice softened. "You've always treated me with kindness. I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to you." Richard swallowed the ache forming in his throat. "And you think I could live with something happening to you?" he asked quietly. She froze. Samuel watched them both, his breathing uneven. "It's too late," he said under his breath. "They already know you followed her." Richard felt the air shift. How would they know? Samuel hesitated, then looked at the far corner of the room. Richard followed his gaze and noticed a small device, barely visible, tucked behind a shelf. It was dusty, like it had been there for months. Almost invisible, unless you knew where to look. A listening device. Richard's pulse kicked faster. "Is that?" "Yes," Samuel said. "They put it there before they threatened Mama. They wanted to know if she'd talk, if she'd run, if she'd tell someone powerful like you." Marlene looked ashamed, but her voice was steady. "I didn't tell them anything. Not one word." Richard stepped closer to the device, but Samuel quickly shook his head. "Don't touch it. If you do, they'll know you found it." Richard froze mid-step, tension spiraling through his chest. "Then they're listening right now?" "Maybe," Samuel said. "Maybe not. They don't monitor it constantly, but they check the recordings. They care about patterns." Richard's mind spun. If someone had been tracking Marlene, and now him, then every move he made tonight could be part of something bigger. He glanced toward the dark hallway outside. Suddenly, the quiet building didn't feel safe at all. A soft creaking sound echoed from the stairwell. Everyone went still. Marlene's hand tightened on Samuel's shoulder. "It's probably just someone going to their apartment," she whispered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Samuel leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "No one uses the stairs at this hour." Another creak followed. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Richard's heartbeat thudded in his ears. He moved closer to Marlene instinctively. She stared at the door, her eyes wide with dread. "Is there a back exit?" Richard murmured. Marlene shook her head. "Not from this floor." The footsteps in the hallway grew clearer now. Slow steps heading toward the number painted on Marlene's door. Each one pressing into Richard's nerves like a fingerprint left by danger. Samuel grasped the armrest of his chair. "They must have followed you," he whispered. "Or they checked the recordings. Or..." He stopped mid-sentence as the footsteps halted right outside. Silence. A suffocating silence that made Richard's breath catch. Then, a gentle knock. 3 taps. Slow, measured, intentional. Nobody moved. Richard felt cold seep into his bones. Whoever was outside wasn't a neighbor. This knock wasn't friendly. It wasn't accidental. It was a message. Marlene looked at Richard with eyes full of apology and fear. "Don't answer," she whispered. Samuel shook his head. "They already know we're inside." The knock came again, louder this time. Richard's instinct screamed that nothing good waited on the other side of that door. His hands curled into fists, though he wasn't sure what he could possibly do if someone dangerous was out there. The third knock echoed like a warning. Then a voice, smooth, calm, unsettling, drifted through the door. "Miss Marlene," it said softly, "we need to talk." Richard's breath hitched. Marlene's entire body went rigid. Samuel's eyes widened with panic. Richard recognized something immediately. The tone. It wasn't the tone of a criminal sneaking around. It was the tone of someone confident, someone certain, someone who knew they held power over whoever was inside. A soft metallic sound clicked. Someone trying a doorknob. Richard felt adrenaline spike. His muscles tensed. Every sense sharpened. The voice spoke again. "Please open the door. You know we don't like to wait." Marlene squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to summon courage from somewhere deep within. Richard stepped closer to her. "Who is that?" he whispered. She opened her eyes slowly, fear swimming in them. She hesitated, then whispered the name of the one person she never wanted near her home, the one person Samuel had tried to escape, the one person whose involvement meant the situation was far more dangerous than Richard ever imagined. And before Richard could fully process the name, the doorknob turned harder, and the lock rattled, and the voice outside grew sharper. "Miss Marlene, last warning." Richard's pulse hammered. Marlene grabbed Samuel's trembling hand, and in that breathless moment, Richard understood one terrifying truth. The danger wasn't coming. It was already here. Richard didn't move at first. He stood there in the cold yard, staring at the dim outline of the shed where Daniel had just disappeared minutes earlier. The tension in the air felt thicker than before, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Eleanor stepped closer to him, her fingers brushing his arm gently, grounding him for a moment. But even her touch couldn't ease the strange heaviness crawling through the house and yard. The silence felt wrong, too controlled, too expectant. A faint rustling sound came from the far side of the shed. Richard turned sharply, expecting Daniel, but the movement was different, slower, more deliberate. For a moment he thought it might be the wind, but even the trees seemed to stay unnaturally still. He took a few careful steps forward, his heart beating harder with every inch. Something was changing, something they hadn't seen coming. Eleanor stayed behind him, clutching her breath. She could tell Richard sensed something she couldn't. He always had that instinct. Ever since the night everything shifted for their family. And now, the same cold warning settled in his chest. He didn't say anything, but Eleanor felt it anyway. Something else was here. Then came a soft click. A door? A latch? Or something being locked? Richard froze, his eyes narrowing at the shed's small window. He could barely make out Daniel's shadow inside, pacing, agitated, moving like someone searching for something that should have been there, but wasn't. Richard's stomach knotted tighter. The letter, the files, the truth Daniel claimed to have found. Was something missing? A sudden light flickered inside the shed. Daniel's silhouette jerked back. Richard stepped forward instinctively. But before he could call out, another presence stepped into view behind Daniel. A figure he hadn't seen before. A shape tall enough that its shadow stretched across the wall like a dark ripple. Richard inhaled sharply. This was not part of the plan. This was not something Daniel or Adrian had prepared them for. Eleanor whispered, "Richard, who is that?" He didn't answer. The truth was he didn't know. But the fear that rose in his throat told him it wasn't someone on their side. The stranger's shadow moved closer to Daniel, slow and quiet, almost calculated. Richard tried to shout, but the words stuck in his throat. It felt like the moment was pressing down on him, forcing him into silence. Then, without warning, the light inside the shed cut out completely. Everything went black. Eleanor gasped softly. Richard rushed forward, but before he reached the shed door, another light flicked on, this time coming from behind them, from the house. Richard turned, and his heart nearly stopped. Richard rushed toward the house, his pulse beating so loudly he could barely hear Eleanor calling after him. Every instinct told him that whatever was happening inside was a moment everything had been building toward. The truth, the danger, the lies Adrian had tried to bury. The back door creaked as Richard pushed it open, stepping into the dim kitchen, where only a single warm light glowed above the stove. The room felt strangely calm, almost too calm, considering the chaos outside. But then he saw Adrian. He stood in the center of the kitchen, his shoulders tight, his expression pale, not angry, not prideful, but shaken. Behind him, the stranger from the shed stood silently, half hidden in the shadows. And next to the stranger, Daniel, breathing hard, shaken but unharmed. Eleanor slipped in behind Richard, relief washing over her at the sight of her son. But she didn't speak. The air was too thick, too close to breaking. Richard stepped between them. Adrian was going on. Adrian looked down at the floor for a long moment before finally lifting his eyes. Something in him had changed, almost like the way of the truth had finally cracked through the version of himself he'd been fighting to protect. "I didn't want it to get this far," Adrian said quietly. "But I knew you'd find the shed. I knew Daniel would see the letters. And I knew once that happened, nothing could stay hidden anymore. Richard clenched his jaw. So you brought someone else into this? Someone who followed us? Watched us? Adrian shook his head quickly. No, he wasn't following you. He was following me. The stranger finally stepped forward, his features clearer now, older than Adrian, with tired eyes and a familiar sharpness in his face. The resemblance hit Richard first, then Eleanor, then Daniel. Daniel whispered, almost breathless, "He looks like you." The man nodded slowly. "That's because he's my brother," Adrian said. And the real reason all this began. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. A second plot Adrian had never mentioned. A person who had been hiding in the shadows long before they even suspected something was wrong. Adrian's voice cracked slightly as he continued. Years ago, before any of us lived here, my brother made choices that nearly cost the entire family everything. I tried to help him disappear, to protect him. The shed, the documents, the story you found, they were only pieces of the truth. I didn't want anyone dragged into it, especially not you. The stranger sighed. I only came back because Adrian said things were getting out of hand. I didn't mean to scare your son. I just needed to get the files before they caused more damage. Daniel looked between them, confusion softening into something else. Understanding, maybe, or exhaustion. Eleanor stepped to his side, holding his arm gently. Richard took a slow breath, piecing everything together. The missing documents, Adrian's panic, the shadow in the shed, the feeling of being watched. It all led back to this hidden brother and the secrets Adrian had tried so desperately to lock away. So this was all about protecting family? Richard asked. Adrian nodded. I was afraid you'd think I was dangerous or lying or capable of something I'm not. I should have trusted you instead of trying to control everything. For the first time that night, the room felt like it was exhaling, until a quiet beat broke the silence. Everyone turned toward the hallway. A small red light blinked on a device near the floor, something none of them had noticed before. The stranger's eyes widened. Adrian's face drained of color. That's not mine, he said under his breath. The stranger stepped forward. It's a tracker. Someone else found me. Someone who's been looking for us both. Richard's chest tightened again. You mean this isn't over? The stranger swallowed hard. No. Whoever planted that knows we're all here. Just then, the front porch light flicked on by itself, washing the hallway in a cold white glow. A silhouette appeared behind the frosted glass of the front door. Not Adrian. Not the stranger. Someone none of them were expecting. The final twist none of them saw coming was now standing just outside the door. The silhouette behind the frosted glass didn't move at first. It simply stood there, still as a shadow carved into the door. Richard felt his pulse hammering again, and Eleanor instinctively stepped closer to Daniel. Adrian lifted a hand slowly, signaling everyone to stay quiet. The stranger, Adrian's brother, took one cautious step back, his expression tightening with recognition, like he already understood who it might be. Then the doorknob turned. The door opened with a soft creak, letting a cold gust slip through the hallway. Light spilled across the floor, stretching the shadow further until the person finally stepped inside. It was Mrs. Harlow, the very woman none of them had expected to see this late, especially not after everything that had happened. She stood with her old coat pulled tight around her shoulders, her small black purse in her hand, and a worried expression softening her tired eyes. "Adrian," she said, breathless and shaken, "someone has been watching your house. I didn't know what else to do. I came to warn you." The room froze. All the fear, all the confusion, all the assumptions they had been carrying collided with the gentle presence of the old maid who had worked in this house for years. Adrian stepped forward. "Mrs. Harlow, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe tonight." She shook her head. "When I was walking home, I noticed a car parked near the corner. It didn't belong to anyone from this neighborhood. And then I saw a man get out and head toward the woods behind your house." Her eyes moved to the stranger, Adrian's brother. "I recognized him from years ago. I thought he might be in trouble, or you might be." The stranger lowered his gaze, his voice quiet. "You recognize me after all these years?" Mrs. Harlow nodded. "You and your brother may have tried to hide many things, But you forget how much a maid sees. Even when she pretends not to, her words carried weight, soft, but firm enough to break through the tension. Richard felt something shift in Adrian's face, almost like shame, almost like gratitude. Eleanor stepped forward gently. "Mrs. Harlow, did you know all along?" She sighed and looked at Adrian. "I didn't know everything, but I knew he was protecting someone. I knew he wasn't the kind of man people whispered he was. And I knew the day would come when the past would try to claw its way back." Adrian swallowed hard. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Mrs. Harlow gave a sad smile. "Because some wounds heal only when people are ready, and some truths reveal themselves when a heart can finally carry them." The stranger stepped closer, looking at her with an expression that held years of regret. "I'm sorry for everything, for what I did back then, and for bringing danger here tonight." She shook her head. "You didn't bring danger. The danger followed you, and now it's time to end it." Adrian took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders. "We're not running anymore. We face it together." Richard felt a surprising sense of unity settle into the room, a feeling he hadn't expected after the long night of confusion and fear. For the first time, it didn't feel like Adrian was a billionaire towering over them with secrets. He was just a man trying to protect his family, the same way anyone would. Outside, the distant hum of a car engine broke the silence. The stranger turned toward the window and let out a slow exhale. "It's him. He's been tracking me since I disappeared. But he won't stop unless I face him." Adrian shook his head. "No, we'll talk to him together. No one is fighting alone tonight." Richard felt a steadiness in his chest, something he hadn't expected. A sense of belonging, maybe, or the realization that even the most powerful people aren't invincible. Everyone needs someone to stand beside them. The car door closed outside. Footsteps crunched toward the house. The porch light glowed against the night as a tall man approached the open door, his hands raised slightly to show he wasn't there to harm anyone. He looked exhausted, as if the search had weighed on him as heavily as the running had weighed on Adrian's brother. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said softly. "I just wanted to stop hiding. The debt he ran from, it's been forgiven. The people he feared, they're gone. I'm here to bring him home, not hurt anyone." The stranger's shoulders fell, relief and disbelief washing over him at once. Adrian stepped forward and put a hand on his brother's arm. "It's over. You're free." Everyone exhaled at the same time, a slow, heavy breath that seemed to release the entire house from the tension gripping it. The man who had been tracking him nodded respectfully and stepped back toward his car, leaving the family united in the doorway. When the car finally drove away, silence settled over the house again. Only this time, it wasn't sharp or frightening. It was peaceful. Mrs. Harlow set her purse down and looked around at the tired faces. "You all look like you haven't slept in days," she said gently. "Sit. You need to breathe again." Even Adrian laughed softly. "Mrs. Harlow, you came into chaos and somehow still managed to act like you're in control." She smiled. "Someone has to be." They all gathered in the kitchen, the same kitchen that had felt so heavy just an hour before. Now it felt like a safe place again. Warm, real, human. Mrs. Harlow made tea, moving around with the ease of someone who had spent years caring for this home and the people in it. Daniel leaned against his mother, finally letting the tension slip away. Richard exchanged a quiet look with Adrian, one that didn't need words. Not forgiveness, not blame, just understanding. Adrian looked at Mrs. Harlow as she poured him tea. "You always knew more than you let on." She nodded. "That's what keeping a home is. It's not just cleaning floors and folding clothes. It's seeing people for who they really are, even when they're still figuring it out themselves." He swallowed. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You owe me nothing," she said softly. "Just live honestly. Take care of the people around you, and stop carrying everything alone." Outside, the porch light clicked off, leaving the house wrapped in calm darkness again. Adrian's brother sat quietly at the table, his hands wrapped around a warm cup, the weight of years finally lifting. He glanced at Richard, at Eleanor, at Daniel. Strangers just hours ago, but somehow part of the story that helped save him. Richard realized something then, something simple but powerful. Sometimes the people we overlook, the ones we think we fully understand, are carrying stories deeper than anything visible on the surface. And sometimes, the person who seems the smallest in the room, the old maid with tired hands and a gentle voice, turns out to be the one holding everything together. The night ended not with fear, but with a quiet sense of healing. And in that warm kitchen, surrounded by people who have been strangers, protectors, and unexpected heroes, Adrian whispered the only truth that mattered now. Family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who stay. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt whole again,